Midnight over the North Atlantic. The water is black glass stretching to infinity. Titanic's decks glitter under a canopy of stars, the air so still that smoke from her funnels rises in perfect columns. Then, a grinding shudder, a sound like tearing metal under deep water. Passengers pause mid-sentence. Glasses tremble in their holders. Below the waterline, 6 gashes begin to fill with ice-cold seawater. At first, it seems almost nothing. The engines hum on. The band plays. Stewards assure anxious guests that there's no danger. But down in the bowels of the ship, water is already pouring through the forward compartments faster than any pump can match. Titanic is mortally wounded, though almost no one yet knows it. Minutes later, the first distress flares rip into the sky, bursting over the Atlantic like white ghosts. Lifeboats swing out, half-filled. In the freezing dark, the ship's bow sinks lower. Then, at 2:20 a.m., a roar, steel twisting, rivets popping, as the great liner breaks apart and slides under. The night is suddenly empty. The sea is filled with voices, cries for help that echo across the water, until, one by one, they fall silent. The survivors would later say it was the most beautiful night they had ever seen, and the most terrible. The sky above the North Atlantic on April 14, 1912 was cloudless, scattered with countless stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The sea lay flat as a mirror. No moonlight to paint the horizon, only the cold gleam of starlight on water. For those aboard Titanic in the hours before the collision, it was a night of quiet elegance. The first-class dining saloon had just emptied, gentlemen strolling the decks in evening dress, ladies wrapped in fur against the chill. In third class, families settled into narrow bunks, lulled by the steady heartbeat of the engines. It was the calm that deceived them all. With out waves breaking against its base, an iceberg could become invisible until it was almost upon them. But no one thought of ice that night. Not here, aboard the unsinkable ship. In the lifeboats later, survivors would recall the strange stillness before the disaster. The creak of rigging, the occasional laughter, the distant strains of music drifting from the smoking room. Then came the jolt, the confused murmurs, and the sight of crewmen hurrying past with faces set in grim determination. Even after the collision, the ship seemed unshaken. Many passengers returned to their cabins, certain that all was well. The great liner still moved through the water, her lights warm against the blackness. Only a few noticed the subtle tilt of the deck, the quiet rush of water far below. As the hours passed and the truth seeped into the night air, that same beauty became almost unbearable. The sky remained brilliant, indifferent. The sea still mirrored the stars, even as it claimed the lives of those struggling in its grip. The perfection of the night was a cruel contrast to the tragedy unfolding, and for those who lived it would forever be burned into memory. A night both magnificent and merciless. And as the minutes ticked down, what none could see was how quickly the balance between safety and catastrophe had already been lost. The floating palace was now a clock running out. Titanic was more than a ship. She was a floating statement of human ambition. At 882 feet long, her decks stretched farther than 3 city blocks. Her first-class suites rivaled the finest hotels in Europe, adorned with rich mahogany paneling, gilded mirrors, and deep carpets that muffled every footstep. The grand staircase rose beneath a glass dome, its wrought-iron balustrades curving like the work of a sculptor. Even the third-class spaces were cleaner, brighter, and more comfortable than those on most other liners. On this night, that grandeur seemed untouchable. Passengers moved through lounges lit by electric chandeliers, their polished brass fittings glowing warmly. Steam curled from the Turkish baths. The smoking rooms hummed with conversation. Somewhere deep below, the great reciprocating engines and turbine turned steadily, their vibration barely noticeable. But beneath the marble, oak, and velvet, the ocean was already at work. Seawater surged into the forward compartments, filling them one by one, forcing the bow to sink ever lower. The ship's design, praised as virtually unsinkable, could withstand 2 flooded compartments, perhaps even 4. Tonight, 6 had been torn open. Above, few realized the danger. Officers walked briskly along the boat deck, giving calm but firm instructions to uncover and swing out the lifeboats. Some passengers hesitated, reluctant to leave the luxury and perceived safety of the largest ship ever built for a small open boat in the dark. Others, sensing the urgency in the crew's voices, gathered family and valuables quickly. The contrast was jarring. Inside, the world still glittered with crystal and silver. Outside, the black Atlantic waited without pity. The liner's deep horn sounded across the water, a low, mournful call swallowed by the vastness of night. Those who paused to look back at the ship from the lifeboats would later remember the sight as almost unreal, a vision of magnificence slowly losing its battle with the sea. Titanic, the pride of the White Star Line, remained every inch the floating palace, but now she was a palace tilting toward ruin. And even as lifeboats began to descend, the most desperate messages of the night were already crackling through the airwaves. In the cramped wireless room, lit by the faint glow of dials and the hiss of static, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride worked furiously at their keys. Just hours earlier they had been buried under a mountain of passenger telegrams, dinner invitations, stock tips, and holiday greetings bound for New York. Now the luxury of polite correspondence was gone. Every tap of the key carried a plea for salvation. At 12:15 a.m., Phillips sent the first distress call. CQD, CQD, here is Titanic. We have struck an iceberg. The message went out in all directions, leaping invisibly from the ship's antenna into the night. Far away, ships heard the desperate rhythm of dots and dashes, some replying at once. Others, like the Californian, just a short distance away, sat in silence, their operators off duty for the night. Minutes later, Phillips added the new code that had only recently been introduced, SOS. It was faster to send, easier to recognize, and in these moments, every second counted. The replies came back, some faint, some strong. The Carpathia, 58 miles away, turning at full speed through ice. The Baltic, changing course but too far to arrive in time, other vessels unsure, asking for coordinates again and again. The wireless room became a world unto itself, 2 young men pounding the keys while the ship beneath them slowly died. Outside, the cold was deepening, the list of the deck becoming more pronounced. Bride remembered Phillips working relentlessly, even as water crept closer to the compartment. He would not leave, Bride later said. He clung to that key until the last. Shortly after 2:00 a.m., with the bow nearly submerged and the power flickering, the final messages sputtered into the darkness. Somewhere out there, voices on other ships heard Titanic's signal weaken, break, and then vanish into the static. For those in the lifeboats, the sky flashed sporadically with the white glare of distress rockets, silent from a distance, but speaking the same desperate language. And for the men on the Carpathia, racing through the ice, every crackle of the receiver carried a simple truth. The clock was almost out. When Titanic's lights finally flickered and went out, the effect was instantaneous, as if the ship had been erased from existence. Moments earlier, the towering liner had been a glowing beacon in the black Atlantic, her rows of portholes and decks shining like a floating city. Then, with one final surge of power, she slipped into total darkness. For those adrift in the lifeboats, the change was shattering. Without the ship's lights, the night seemed vaster, the sea more merciless. The only illumination came from the endless canopy of stars above, mirrored faintly in the glassy surface of the water. Somewhere in that emptiness, hundreds of voices cried out, their shouts overlapping, breaking, and fading into hoarse pleas. The cold was immediate and biting. Lifeboats, some nearly empty, drifted far apart, each its own fragile island. The swell was gentle, almost mocking. No waves to fight against, only the slow, relentless chill of the air and sea. In some boats, people sat in stunned silence, too numb to speak. In others, arguments broke out, whether to row back for those in the water or stay away for fear of being swamped. From a distance, survivors could just make out the shape of debris on the water. Wooden chairs, planks, a child's toy. Every now and then, a faint splash echoed across the stillness, as if the ocean were claiming its prizes one by one. Above, the stars glittered with a terrible indifference. It was a night so still, so beautiful, that it could have been painted, and yet within it the greatest maritime disaster of the age was unfolding in silence. For those who lived to tell of it, the sound of the final cries, sharp at first, then fewer, then gone, would haunt their dreams for decades. Somewhere beyond the darkness, help was coming, but for the hundreds still in the water, rescue was already too late. And as dawn began its slow crawl over the eastern horizon, the question loomed like the icebergs themselves. How had such a dream ended here, in this frozen void? The early 20th century was an age of speed, size, and spectacle on the oceans. For decades, Britain and Germany had been locked in a fierce competition to dominate the lucrative transatlantic passenger trade. German liners like Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse and Deutschland had captured headlines by winning the Blue Riband, the unofficial title for the fastest crossing of the Atlantic. Each launch was a blow to British pride, and for White Star Line, a challenge that could not be ignored. Rather than chasing speed records, White Star's chairman, J. Bruce Ismay, envisioned a different kind of supremacy. Unmatched luxury. If the Germans could claim the fastest ships, White Star would build the largest and most opulent. The company's answer came in the form of a trio of giant liners, Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, each designed to be a floating palace. Across the Atlantic, Cunard Line had already unveiled its own champions, Lusitania and Mauretania, both marvels of speed and engineering, with government subsidies and the latest turbine technology. White Star's strategy, however, was not to outrun them, but to outshine them. Their ships would offer spacious cabins, grand public rooms, and comfort that rivaled the finest hotels. The rivalry was not just about business. It was about national prestige. In the Edwardian era, ocean liners were symbols of industrial power, as visible and celebrated as dreadnought battleships. Each voyage was a demonstration of a nation's engineering prowess, a floating flag carried across the sea. By the time Titanic's keel was laid in 1909 at Harland Wolff in Belfast, the race for ocean supremacy had reached a fever pitch. Newspapers breathlessly compared specifications, and the public devoured every sketch and rumour about the coming giants. Titanic, it was promised, would be the largest moving object ever built, a vessel so advanced that her very name would become shorthand for invincibility. Yet in that same pride lay the seed of overconfidence. In chasing the crown of the Atlantic, no one imagined that the most celebrated ship in history might instead become the most tragic. The stage was set, and Belfast's shipyard would soon turn steel dreams into a reality that seemed beyond failure. In the first years of the 20th century, Belfast was a city alive with the clang of industry. The Harland Wolff shipyard dominated its eastern waterfront, a sprawling forest of gantries, cranes, and sheds where steel was shaped into leviathans of the sea. For the thousands of men who laboured there, shipbuilding was not just work. It was identity, pride, and proof that Belfast stood among the industrial giants of the age. When word spread that White Star Line had commissioned a new class of ocean liners, the largest ever attempted, the excitement was electric. Harland Wolff's designers, led by Chief Naval Architect Thomas Andrews, began turning bold concepts into detailed plans. Every rivet, beam, and plate would be shaped in Belfast, each step a testament to the city's skill. Construction began in March 1909 with the laying of Titanic's keel. Over the next 2 years, her steel skeleton rose within the towering gantry built specifically to house her and her sister ship, Olympic. From the cobbled streets nearby, townspeople could see her bulk growing day by day, dwarfing the buildings along the Logan River. Children clung to the railings for a glimpse of history in the making. Titanic was not just a commission for Harland Wolff. It was a project that fed the local economy, employed thousands, and filled the pubs and markets with talk of the new giant. The shipyard workforce, from skilled riveters to young apprentices, took fierce pride in their work. Many would later say they felt as if the ship belonged to Belfast itself. When Titanic was launched on May 31, 1911, the city turned out in force. 20,000 spectators lined the quays, cheering as the massive hull slid gracefully into the water for the first time. Bands played, dignitaries toasted, and the newspapers proclaimed the launch a triumph. The ship, still incomplete inside, was already a wonder, a sleek steel promise that Belfast had delivered something unmatched in human history. In those days, no one could imagine that this monument to industrial pride would also be the city's most haunting legacy. From the shipyard floor to the drawing rooms of the elite, Titanic's story was gathering momentum, and the world would soon know her name. The world into which Titanic was born was brimming with self-assurance. It was the Edwardian era, a time when the great powers saw themselves on an unstoppable march toward progress. Science and engineering seemed capable of conquering every obstacle. Skyscrapers pierced the skies, railways spanned continents, and wireless signals leapt invisibly across oceans. If man could bridge the Atlantic with words in an instant, surely he could cross it in perfect safety. In this climate, the idea of an unsinkable ship did not seem like hubris. It felt inevitable. Maritime disasters still occurred, but they were increasingly viewed as relics of a less advanced age, the sort of thing that happened to wooden ships in storms, not to steel giants built in the world's most modern shipyards. The press and public eagerly embraced Titanic as a symbol of this new mastery over nature. Her watertight compartments and remotely operated doors were described as marvels of safety. As far as it is possible to do so, one brochure boasted, she is designed to be unsinkable. Such language carried weight in an age that believed technology could outwit the sea itself. This confidence was not just technological, but social. The rigid class structures of the time seemed as unshakable as steel. The first-class decks were for the wealthy and powerful, captains of industry, titled aristocrats and celebrities, while steerage carried the hopeful poor seeking new lives in America. Each group accepted its place without question, convinced the order of things was natural, even eternal. It was an age when speed records, engineering marvels, and feats of human daring filled newspapers with headlines. The Wright brothers had flown only 9 years earlier, the Panama Canal was under construction, motorcars were beginning to overtake the horse. Every year the impossible seemed to become possible. In such a world, Titanic's launch was more than an event. It was an affirmation. She was the floating embodiment of the belief that man had mastered his environment. Yet, in that conviction lay a dangerous blindness, the inability to imagine failure. And as the finishing touches were placed aboard the ship, no one suspected that this pinnacle of confidence would become a symbol of its collapse. Titanic began as lines on paper, elegant curves traced by the hand of naval architect Alexander Carlisle, refined by Thomas Andrews and the design team at Harland Wolff. The plans called for a vessel of unprecedented dimensions, 882 feet long, 92 feet wide, and over 46,000 gross tons. She would tower over the waterline, with decks stacked like a floating city and a profile crowned by 4 great funnels, the 4th added purely for aesthetic balance. The ship's skeleton would be a lattice of steel beams and ribs clad in nearly 3 million rivets. 16 watertight compartments divided the hull, each sealed by remotely controlled doors that could, in theory, keep Titanic afloat even if 4 compartments flooded. This was the heart of her reputation for safety, and in the blueprints it looked unassailable. Above the hull, the focus turned to comfort and grandeur. The designers mapped out an interior that rivaled the finest hotels, a grand staircase with an ornate glass dome, a first-class dining saloon seating hundreds, smoking rooms panelled in rich woods, a Turkish bath, and a heated swimming pool, the first of its kind at sea. Even third-class passengers would enjoy clean, bright cabins and communal spaces far beyond the norm. Carlyle and Andrews sweated every detail, from the angle of the propeller blades to the layout of the promenade decks. The ship's triple-screw propulsion system, 2 reciprocating engines and a turbine, promised both power and smoothness, with a service speed of 21 knots. Titanic was not designed to win races, but she would travel fast enough to impress and steady enough to soothe. Every blueprint line was a balance between efficiency, elegance, and safety. Yet in the design room, compromises were inevitable. The lifeboat capacity, for example, was calculated to meet Board of Trade regulations for ships up to 10,000 tons. Titanic was over 4 times that size. The original plan for 64 lifeboats was reduced to 20, partly to preserve the wide-open boat deck for strolling passengers. On paper, Titanic was a masterpiece, the perfect harmony of engineering, precision, and luxury living. The blueprints told a story of progress, but they could not show the flaws that reality would one day expose. And as steel began to replace ink, that story was about to become flesh and bone in the Belfast shipyard. By the time Titanic neared completion in early 1912, she was more than a ship. She was a statement. The Edwardian world was stepping confidently into a new century, and Titanic was its ambassador, carrying the symbols of industrial triumph, imperial pride, and boundless ambition. She was built not just to transport people, but to project an image, Britain's mastery of the seas. The White Star Line envisioned her as the flagship of a fleet that would redefine ocean travel. Her sheer size was staggering. Taller than many city buildings, longer than the tallest skyscraper was high, and so vast that standing on her decks felt like standing in the middle of a small town. Inside, she reflected the refined tastes of her age. First-class suites boasted marble fireplaces, 4-poster beds, and private promenades. The dining saloon was lit by glittering crystal chandeliers, while the Café Parisien offered the novelty of open-air seating shielded by glass. Second-class passengers enjoyed accommodations comparable to first class on many other liners. Even in third class, passengers found private cabins and dining halls that broke with the cramped, grim tradition of steerage travel. Titanic was also a showcase for modern technology. She had electric elevators, a telephone system, and powerful wireless equipment capable of reaching hundreds of miles. Her watertight compartments, operated by hydraulic doors, were seen as the final word in maritime safety. Practically unsinkable became a phrase repeated in newspapers and dinner conversations alike. For the White Star Line, Titanic represented a new kind of travel, not a race against time, but a journey wrapped in comfort and status. To sail aboard her was to participate in the theatre of modern luxury, whether one was a millionaire industrialist or an immigrant bound for a new life. When she prepared for her maiden voyage in April 1912, Titanic was hailed as a ship for the new century, vast, elegant, and utterly confident. No one, not her builders, her crew, her owners, nor her passengers, could imagine she would also become a symbol of that century's most sobering lesson. The stage was set, The dream was afloat, and the world was watching. Titanic was not merely a ship, she was a world unto herself. Once fully outfitted, she became a living city riding the waves, complete with its own streets, public squares, and private sanctuaries. Her 11 decks connected a hierarchy of spaces, each tailored to the needs and expectations of her passengers. First-class travelers entered a realm of elegance that rivaled the grandest hotels on land. The grand staircase rose in sweeping curves beneath a wrought iron and oak balustrade, crowned by a glass dome that flooded the space with daylight. Beyond it lay smoking rooms with deep leather chairs, lounges lined with rich wood paneling, and promenade decks stretching the length of the ship. Dining was a social performance. Multi-course meals served on fine china with menus that read like poetry. Second-class accommodations were refined and comfortable with their own library, smoking room, and spacious cabins. For many middle-class travelers, the voyage aboard Titanic offered a taste of privilege, usually far beyond reach. Third class, often called steerage, was a world transformed from the cramped, airless quarters of older ships. Here, Titanic's designers provided bright, ventilated cabins, long dining tables where families could share hot meals and public spaces that allowed for music and conversation. For immigrant passengers bound for America, these comforts were a small preview of the better life they sought. The ship's amenities were astonishing: a heated swimming pool, a fully equipped gymnasium, Turkish and electric baths, electric elevators, and a telephone system connecting key areas. The wireless room, with its Marconi equipment, linked Titanic to the wider world in real time. Even the mail room was a hub of activity, carrying thousands of letters and parcels across the ocean. Every hour of the day, life aboard followed a rhythm, stewards tending to cabins, crew keeping the ship's machinery running with clockwork precision, passengers strolling the decks, and the band playing soft melodies in the background. It was a city that moved, a self-contained society gliding through the cold Atlantic night. Yet beneath this perfection was an unspoken truth. In Titanic's floating city, not all streets led to safety. The divisions built into her decks and bulkheads would soon play a deadly role in deciding who lived and who died. When Titanic departed Southampton on April 10, 1912, she carried a cross-section of humanity as varied as any great city. Aboard were more than 2,200 souls, aristocrats and industrial tycoons, middle-class professionals, labourers and families fleeing hardship for the promise of America. In first class, the passenger list read like a society column. There was John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest men in the world, travelling with his young bride. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune, sailed with his valet and a companion. Isidore and Ida Strauss, co-owners of Macy's department store, occupied one of the most luxurious suites. These were people accustomed to a life where the finest was the norm, and Titanic was designed to meet their every expectation. Second class was a different world, populated by school teachers, merchants, clergy, and professionals. Many were Americans returning home or Europeans heading to new careers abroad. For them, Titanic offered a taste of first-class comfort at a fraction of the cost. Private cabins, fine dining, and public rooms filled with books, music, and conversation. In third class, the faces told stories of hope and desperation. Irish labourers, Swedish farmers, Lebanese shopkeepers, and English families seeking new beginnings crowded the lower decks. Many had spent their life savings on a ticket to America. Conditions here, though modest by comparison, were bright, clean, and unprecedentedly comfortable for steerage travel. Shared dining halls served hearty meals, and corridors rang with the sound of children playing and musicians striking up familiar folk tunes. Yet for all these passengers, whether in opulent suites or simple bunks, the ship was more than transport. It was a chance, a promise, a bridge between past and future. Some travelled for business, others for love, adventure, or survival. The social divisions aboard were clear, both in ticket price and in physical barriers. Stairways, corridors, and gates separated the classes, not out of malice but by design, a reflection of the world they lived in. These invisible lines would soon take on a grim importance. For now the voyage was only days old, and the great ship carried them all forward together, unaware that destiny waited cold and silent on the open sea. Before Titanic ever touched the water, her reputation had already begun to take shape in headlines and advertisements. The White Star Line spared no effort in promoting their newest marvel as the pinnacle of safety, comfort, and modernity. Though the word unsinkable was never officially stamped on her brochures, it echoed in the public's imagination thanks to repeated claims that she was, as far as humanly possible, designed to be unsinkable. The design features were impressive. 16 watertight compartments sealed by remotely operated bulkhead doors, a double-bottomed hull, and a structure built from the strongest steel available. Newspapers reported these facts with an almost reverent tone, transforming engineering specifications into something like myth. By the time Titanic was ready for her maiden voyage, the belief in her invulnerability was widespread, and not only among the public. Many crew members and even experienced mariners shared that quiet certainty. Part of the allure was psychological. In an era of industrial triumph, the public wanted to believe that human ingenuity had finally mastered the dangers of the sea. Other liners had sunk before, but those were relics of an earlier time. Titanic was the embodiment of the new age, a vessel so advanced that it seemed immune to fate. This confidence filtered into every aspect of her operation. The Board of Trade's outdated lifeboat requirements, sufficient for just over 1,000 people, were accepted without question because it was assumed lifeboats would only serve to ferry passengers to rescue ships in the unlikely event of trouble. The idea of needing space for everyone on board was seen as unnecessary, even excessive. Passengers, reading glowing reports in the press, boarded with a sense of pride and reassurance. For the wealthy, it was the prestige of sailing on the greatest ship afloat. For immigrants and travellers in lower classes, it was the comfort of knowing their journey was in the safest hands possible. It was a reputation built as much on faith as on fact, and like all myths, it would meet its test in the cold reality of the North Atlantic. Soon Titanic would sail, carrying her unsinkable name toward the test no one believed would come. The morning of April 10th, 1912, dawned bright and crisp over Southampton. Along the quay, a crowd gathered to see the largest ship in the world set out on her first journey. Titanic loomed above them like a steel cliff, her 4 great funnels towering into the sky, her decks alive with the bustle of last-minute preparations. Dock workers loaded crates of fresh produce, mail bags and luggage, while passengers made their way up the gangways, some waving to friends and family, others quiet with anticipation. At noon, the ship's massive ropes were cast off. A deep blast from her whistle echoed across the harbour as tugs guided her into the channel. There was a brief moment of drama when Titanic's immense bulk caused suction that nearly pulled the moored liner New York into her path. Quick manoeuvring by tugboats averted collision, and with that the maiden voyage continued without further incident. Her first stop was Cherbourg, France, where a tender ferried new passengers aboard, including wealthy Americans returning home. From there, she sailed to Queenstown, now Cowes, Ireland, to take on her final passengers, many of them emigrants bound for new lives in the United States. With the last mail loaded and the anchor raised, Titanic turned westward toward the open Atlantic. Life aboard quickly settled into its rhythm. First-class guests strolled along wide promenades or sipped tea in the Café Parisien, enjoying panoramic views of the sea. In second class, passengers gathered in the library or on deck to watch the sun glitter over the waves. Below, third-class travellers explored the bright dining saloons and open-air spaces, savouring meals far better than those served on most other ships. The weather was calm, the sea smooth, and the ship's engines pushed her steadily forward at over 21 knots. Conversations turned to business in New York, the charms of Paris, or the excitement of starting anew in America. In every class there was the unspoken confidence that nothing could interrupt the voyage. For many, it felt less like a crossing and more like a holiday, a journey to be remembered for its comfort and grandeur. Few imagined that in just days, this same voyage would be remembered for something else entirely. Aboard Titanic, the Atlantic crossing was not simply a matter of getting from one shore to the other. It was a performance, and every passenger played a part. For the elite in first class, the ship itself became an extension of their drawing rooms, a place to see and be seen. Morning promenades were an opportunity to exchange greetings, assess the latest fashions, and establish one's presence among the distinguished company on board. The first-class smoking room filled each afternoon with the scent of cigars and the low murmur of conversation about politics, investments, and the latest society gossip. In the evenings, ladies in silks and diamonds descended the grand staircase to the dining saloon, where multi-course dinners were accompanied by fine wines and soft music. Every gesture, from the selection of a seat at table to the timing of an after-dinner stroll, was part of an unspoken social choreography. Second-class life mirrored this on a smaller scale. Passengers formed circles of friendship over games of cards or tea in the library, enjoying a rare chance to relax far from the pressures of work. Shared meals in the second-class dining room offered hearty fare and lively conversation, while the promenade deck allowed them to watch the same sunsets as the wealthiest guests above. In third class, the atmosphere was warmer, less formal, and often more joyful. Families shared benches along the open rails, swapping stories in a dozen languages. Young men gathered to play the fiddle or dance reels, their music echoing down the corridors. For many immigrants, this was a final moment to savour old traditions before stepping into a new world. Yet the social divisions aboard were clear. Locked gates and separate staircases kept the classes apart, more for customs and immigration requirements than for overt snobbery. Still, curiosity sometimes crossed the barriers. A wealthy first-class passenger might lean over a rail to watch an Irish jig below, just as a steerage traveller might pause to admire the elegance of the upper decks from afar. On Titanic, the ocean was the great backdrop, but society's script played out much as it did ashore. Each class in its place, each group living its own version of the voyage. And while the social stage shone brightly in those days at sea, the final act of this voyage would soon bring every class together under the same cold stars. By Sunday, April 14, 1912, Titanic had been at sea for 4 days. The weather remained clear, the sea calm, and the voyage seemed charmed. Yet beneath the surface of this tranquility, a chain of warnings was quietly forming, and quietly ignored. That morning, the wireless operators received the first of several iceberg reports from other ships travelling ahead on the northern route. The Coronia signalled about bergs, growlers, and field ice directly in Titanic's path. Later came messages from the Baltic and the America, each noting dangerous ice further west. These warnings were dutifully passed to the bridge, but no orders were given to change course or reduce speed. By the afternoon, the Mesaba sent a particularly stark message. A long field of ice and heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs directly across Titanic's intended track. It was one of the most important warnings of the day, yet it never reached Captain Smith. Wireless operator Jack Phillips, busy transmitting passenger messages to Cape Race, set it aside to deliver later. Shortly after 9:30 p.m., the Californian reported being stopped for the night surrounded by ice. Phillips, still handling a backlog of personal messages, replied curtly for them to keep clear of his busy signal traffic. The bridge remained aware of some ice in the area, but the prevailing belief in Titanic's invulnerability, combined with the still, clear night, led to no change in the ship's pace. At nearly 22 knots, she steamed on into the dark. In the wireless room, the air crackled with conversations between ships, most routine, some urgent. On deck, passengers bundled against the chill for one last stroll before bed, unaware that their fate was being shaped not by the sea, but by the quiet decision to let the voyage continue at full speed. Had every warning been heeded, Titanic might have slowed or shifted further south, but the world's largest and most celebrated liner pressed forward, the danger invisible on the glassy horizon. By midnight, the ship was sailing blind into an icy graveyard, and the clock was already ticking. On the night of April 14th, the Californian, a modest British cargo passenger steamer, found itself trapped in an expanse of drifting ice. Captain Stanley Lord, wary of damaging his ship, ordered her to stop for the night around 10:20 p.m. The crew could see massive bergs looming in the moonless dark, their ghostly shapes faint against the starlit horizon. Earlier in the evening, the Californian had warned Titanic directly of the ice field ahead, but the message, sent over the wireless at a time when Titanic's operator Jack Phillips was swamped with passenger telegrams, was met with irritation. Phillips cut the conversation short with a brusque, "Shut up! Shut up! I'm busy working Cape Race." The Californian's wireless set was switched off soon afterward, standard practice for a ship at rest. And with that, the last chance for direct communication was gone. Around 11:00 p.m., Titanic's lights appeared on the southern horizon to the Californian's watch officers. From the Californian's bridge, the great liner was a dazzling sight, her decks aglow, her shape unmistakable even at distance. Yet, as the hours passed, the lights seemed to grow oddly tilted, then vanish and reappear. A junior officer thought he saw flashes, distress rockets, but their meaning was debated. White rockets could signal trouble, but they could also be festive displays. Captain Lord, informed of the sightings, reportedly asked if the lights could be from another liner, perhaps stopped for the night. No orders were given to wake the wireless operator or attempt to reach the mysterious vessel by Morse lamp. The Californian remained still in the ice, its crew watching events unfold with growing confusion, but no action. When the truth became known the next morning, the Californian would be vilified as the ship that stood still within sight of disaster. The inquests that followed would debate forever how close she truly was. Estimates ranged from 5 miles to 20, but the bitter fact remained: a ship sat nearby while Titanic fought for her life. In the icy dark, two vessels lay separated by a few miles of sea and a chasm of missed signals, each unaware of how fate had already tied them together. By the evening of April 14th, Titanic was ploughing eastward at nearly 22 knots, just shy of her maximum speed. For Captain Edward J. Smith, this was routine practice. Large liners of the era often maintained high speeds through the North Atlantic, unless fog or storms made visibility poor. In clear weather, it was considered both safe and expected. Smith was a veteran mariner with nearly 40 years at sea, and his reputation as the millionaire's captain rested on both his skill and his calm, reassuring demeanor. He had commanded Titanic's sister ship Olympic and knew the route intimately. To him, the ice warnings were cause for vigilance, not alarm. Titanic's powerful engines could be stopped or reversed in moments, or so many believed, and her steel hull was thought to be all but invulnerable. There was also the unspoken pressure of reputation. Titanic's maiden voyage was under the scrutiny of the press, competitors, and her owners. Arriving in New York on schedule, or even ahead of schedule, would enhance the image of efficiency and prestige. Slowing down for a hazard that might be miles off course was not the White Star Line's way. The calm, glassy surface of the ocean that night only reinforced the sense of safety. With no swell to obscure the view, it was assumed that any iceberg would be spotted in time to maneuver. In reality, the stillness removed one of the best visual clues for night lookouts, the white surf breaking at an iceberg's base. Some later speculated that a moderate reduction in speed might have given the crew precious extra seconds to react, turning a fatal collision into a glancing scrape, or avoiding the berg entirely. But on Titanic's bridge that night, speed was a sign of confidence, not recklessness. The decision to maintain pace was not unusual for the time. It was in keeping with the culture of North Atlantic liners. Yet on this particular night, with ice ahead and visibility limited to the distance starlight could reach, the choice would bring the ship ever closer to the point of no return. And as darkness deepened, the conditions would conspire to hide the danger until it was almost too late to see. The night of April 14th, 1912 was eerily perfect and fatally deceptive. The North Atlantic lay still as a pond, its surface so smooth that starlight reflected off it like black glass. There was no moon to paint the ice in silver, no wind to ripple the water or break against the base of a berg. For a lookout scanning the horizon, this was the most dangerous kind of calm. Normally, an iceberg could be spotted at night by the white water breaking at its base as waves struck it. But with the sea dead calm, there was no surf to betray its presence. The bergs drifted silently, dark shapes against a dark horizon. Even the clearest eyesight would struggle to pick them out until they were dangerously close. From the crow's nest, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee peered into the void ahead. They had no binoculars. A set had been left behind in Southampton due to a last-minute change in officers, and the key to the storage locker was missing. Instead, they relied on naked eyes, scanning constantly for the faintest outline, a change in the stars, or a shadow that should not be there. The temperature was falling. Just after 10 o'clock p.m., the mercury dropped below freezing, a telltale sign of entering iceberg waters. Passengers strolling the decks pulled their coats tighter and soon retreated indoors, leaving the upper decks almost deserted. Below, the steady throb of the engines and the faint hum of conversation in lounges created the illusion that nothing could disturb the night's peace. Yet the beauty of the scene was treacherous. Without moonlight or wind, ice could loom out of the darkness without warning. Those who survived would later remember how sudden it was. One moment, nothing but stars and sea. The next, a towering white shape dead ahead. Somewhere in that expanse of cold, silent water, the iceberg that would seal Titanic's fate was drifting directly into her path, unseen and unmarked, waiting in the perfect stillness. And on the bridge, the ship pressed on at full speed, the night's deceptive calm masking the danger closing in. Titanic's designers had built her to be a triumph of modern engineering, and in that achievement lay a dangerous sense of security. 16 watertight compartments ran along her lower decks, separated by heavy steel bulkheads. Hydraulic doors could be closed at the touch of a switch on the bridge, sealing off any damaged section from the rest of the ship. In theory, even if 4 compartments were flooded, Titanic would remain afloat. This feature was widely celebrated in the press and touted by the White Star Line as proof of her near invincibility. Passengers heard about the watertight doors from stewards, read about them in pamphlets, and saw diagrams displayed on board. The message was clear. Here was a ship that could not be lost to the sea. The flaw in this assurance lay in the details. The bulkheads between compartments did not extend high enough to be completely sealed against the ocean's relentless rise. If water filled one compartment and spilled over its top, it would pour into the next, creating a domino effect. The system could buy time, perhaps hours, but it could not prevent the ship from sinking if too many compartments were breached. For Captain Smith and his officers, this was not a flaw they expected to face. No iceberg could possibly open more than a few compartments, they believed. It would take a catastrophic accident to overwhelm the defences, and with experienced crew, clear weather, and calm seas, such an accident seemed unthinkable. This trust in technology shaped every decision. It contributed to maintaining full speed despite ice reports, to the confidence of passengers when told there was no cause for alarm after the collision, and even to the slow pace of loading lifeboats in the early minutes of the disaster. In a way, Titanic was a victim not only of an iceberg, but of the very faith that had created her. The belief that human ingenuity had conquered the sea was woven into her design, her reputation, and her voyage. A belief that would shatter in less than 3 hours. The perfect storm of missed warnings, dangerous conditions, and overconfidence had aligned. Ahead, just minutes remained before steel would meet ice. High above Titanic's bow, in a small wooden platform known as the Crow's Nest, 2 men stood against the biting cold. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee had been on duty since 10 p.m., their eyes straining into the black void ahead. It was the loneliest post on the ship, exposed to the wind, separated from the warmth and light below, with nothing but the hum of the ship's passage through water for company. That night, the cold was sharper than usual. The air shone so clear that the stars looked close enough to touch. Yet this clarity was deceptive. Without a moon and with the sea lying perfectly flat, the horizon was nearly invisible. Fleet and Lee searched for anything out of place, a darker patch against the stars, a shadow that moved where it shouldn't. They worked without binoculars. A set had been aboard, but when the ship sailed from Southampton, the key to the locker had been inadvertently taken ashore by an officer transferred at the last minute. Now, only naked eyes stood between Titanic and any obstacle in her path. At regular intervals, the lookouts struck the ship's bell and telephoned the bridge to report all's well. It was a routine born from thousands of uneventful miles at sea. Yet Fleet felt an unease he couldn't explain. Ice warnings had been passed among the crew, and he knew the ship was in dangerous waters. Below, the bow cut through the Atlantic at nearly 22 knots. The great hull vibrated faintly, a reminder of the immense power driving her forward. For those on deck, the night felt calm and endless. For the men in the Crow's Nest, it was a constant test of vigilance. At 11:39 p.m., Fleet's eyes caught something. A faint, dark shape directly ahead, rising where moments before there had been only sky. His pulse quickened. The shadow grew larger, resolving into the pale outline of an iceberg. Fleet acted instantly, reaching for the bell rope. 3 sharp clangs split the night. At the same time, he grabbed the phone to the bridge and shouted the words that would seal Titanic's fate. "Iceberg, right ahead." The flaw in this assurance lay in the details. The bulkheads between compartments did not extend high enough to be completely sealed against the ocean's relentless rise. If water filled one compartment and spilled over its top, it would pour into the next, creating a domino effect. The system could buy time, perhaps hours, but it could not prevent the ship from sinking if too many compartments were breached. For Captain Smith and his officers, this was not a flaw they expected to face. No iceberg could possibly open more than a few compartments, they believed. It would take a catastrophic accident to overwhelm the defences, and with experienced crew, clear weather, and calm seas, such an accident seemed unthinkable. This trust in technology shaped every decision. It contributed to maintaining full speed despite ice reports, to the confidence of passengers when told there was no cause for alarm after the collision, and even to the slow pace of loading lifeboats in the early minutes of the disaster. In a way, Titanic was a victim not only of an iceberg, but of the very faith that had created her. The belief that human ingenuity had conquered the sea was woven into her design, her reputation, and her voyage. A belief that would shatter in less than 3 hours. The perfect storm of missed warnings, dangerous conditions, and overconfidence had aligned. Ahead, just minutes remained before steel would meet ice. High above Titanic's bow, in a small wooden platform known as the Crow's Nest, 2 men stood against the biting cold. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee had been on duty since 10 o'clock p.m., their eyes straining into the black void ahead. It was the loneliest post on the ship, exposed to the wind, separated from the warmth and light below, with nothing but the hum of the ship's passage through water for company. That night, the cold was sharper than usual. The air shone so clear that the stars looked close enough to touch. Yet this clarity was deceptive. Without a moon and with the sea lying perfectly flat, the horizon was nearly invisible. Fleet and Lee searched for anything out of place, a darker patch against the stars, a shadow that moved where it shouldn't. They worked without binoculars. A set had been aboard, but when the ship sailed from Southampton, the key to the locker had been inadvertently taken ashore by an officer transferred at the last minute. Now, only naked eyes stood between Titanic and any obstacle in her path. At regular intervals, the lookouts struck the ship's bell and telephoned the bridge to report all's well. It was a routine born from thousands of uneventful miles at sea. Yet Fleet felt an unease he couldn't explain. Ice warnings had been passed among the crew, and he knew the ship was in dangerous waters. Below, the bow cut through the Atlantic at nearly 22 knots. The great hull vibrated faintly, a reminder of the immense power driving her forward. For those on deck, the night felt calm and endless. For the men in the Crow's Nest, it was a constant test of vigilance. At 11:39 p.m., Fleet's eyes caught something. A faint, dark shape directly ahead, rising where moments before there had been only sky. His pulse quickened. The shadow grew larger, resolving into the pale outline of an iceberg. Fleet acted instantly, reaching for the bell rope. 3 sharp clangs split the night. At the same time, he grabbed the phone to the bridge and shouted the words that would seal Titanic's fate. "Iceberg, right ahead." Above, most passengers barely noticed anything amiss. A few curious souls stepped onto the boat deck, peering into the darkness and wondering about the faint smell of ice on the wind. Some returned to bed, reassured by stewards that all was well. On the bridge, Captain Smith arrived moments after the impact, his expression grave as Murdoch explained the maneuver and the damage. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was summoned at once to assess the situation. In the calm that followed the brief shudder, Titanic sailed on for several minutes. But beneath her, the ocean was already claiming its first victory. The blow had been glancing, but its consequence was final. Captain Edward Smith stood on the bridge, his breath visible in the freezing air as Thomas Andrews arrived from his stateroom. The ship's designer had been in quiet conversation when the impact came, and now he hurried forward with a pencil and notebook in hand. Without ceremony, Smith and Andrews descended into Titanic's wounded lower decks, accompanied by Chief Officer Henry Wilde. In the forward stokeholds, the scene was grim. Water surged through jagged openings in the steel, swirling around boilers and hissing as it met the heat. Firemen were already retreating, their boots splashing through the rising flood. The mailroom was worse. Sacks of letters floated aimlessly in icy water that lapped at the clerks' waists. In cargo holds, the flood was deafening, a rushing roar that left no doubt about the sea's strength. Andrews took quick measurements, mentally calculating how many compartments had been breached. His face hardened as the truth became clear. The first 5, possibly 6, were flooding. Titanic's design could withstand the loss of 4, but not this. The waterline would rise above the top of each bulkhead, spilling from one compartment to the next until the ship's buoyancy was gone. Baki Masas and the bridge, Andrews spoke quietly, but without hesitation. She will sink, he told Smith. It is a mathematical certainty. His estimate was stark, perhaps an hour and a half, 2 at most. Smith absorbed the words without visible reaction, but those nearby sensed the weight settling over him. Titanic's fate was sealed. The question now was how many lives could be saved. Orders were given to uncover the lifeboats and prepare the passengers. The wireless operators were instructed to send distress signals immediately. Yet there was no rush in the ship's movement, no outward sign to betray the catastrophe underway. Titanic's engines had stopped, and she floated almost serenely on the still ocean. Above, passengers looked out over the calm water, puzzled by the unusual activity among the crew. Few grasped the scale of the disaster, and even those who sensed trouble could not imagine the great liner actually foundering. The assessments were complete. The clock had begun. Now came the most critical decisions of the night. Captain Smith returned to the bridge with the knowledge no master ever wants. His ship was doomed. The time for hesitation was gone. His voice, calm but urgent, carried over the cold deck. Call all hands. Get the boats uncovered. The command rippled through the officers. Chief Officer Wilde oversaw the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch joined him, and Second Officer Lightoller took charge of the port side. Boatswains and deckhands moved quickly, swinging the wooden lifeboats out from their cradles with creaks of rope and groans of davits. The sharp clang of the boat falls hitting the metal hull rang out in the stillness. Smith gave further orders. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were to send distress calls continuously. "Give them everything we've got," he told them. "Tell them we're sinking." Rockets were to be fired at intervals, their white glare exploding high above the black ocean. Lookouts were told to keep watch for any approaching vessel. Passengers were still largely unaware of the scale of the disaster. Stewards moved through the first-class lounges, knocking politely on stateroom doors, asking guests to dress warmly and bring life jackets as a precaution. In second and third class, the message was slower to arrive, tangled by language barriers and the physical barriers between decks. The captain's instructions followed the long-standing maritime rule, women and children first. This order, however, was subject to interpretation. Lightoller enforced it strictly on the port side, allowing only women and children into the boats unless none were in sight, while Murdoch on the starboard side interpreted it as women and children first, but men if there's room. Lifeboat capacity was limited to about half of those aboard, and many officers still believed Titanic would stay afloat until help arrived. The first boats were lowered with far fewer than their full complement, an error that would soon prove costly. Smith's final directive to his officers was simple and grave. Do your duty. There was no discussion of abandoning ship himself. Tradition and his own sense of command meant he would go down with her if need be. The machinery of evacuation was now in motion. The great ship, still outwardly majestic, had begun her slow, irreversible descent into the Atlantic. The first minutes of Titanic's evacuation were marked not by panic, but by uncertainty. Passengers stepped onto the boat deck in small groups, many wrapped in heavy coats over evening dress or night clothes, life jackets awkwardly strapped over fine fabrics. The air was sharp and still. The ship's lights glowed warmly, and the decks beneath their feet felt solid. Stewards reassured them that the lifeboats were simply a precaution, that Titanic had stopped due to a slight mishap. For many, the idea of leaving a vast, brightly lit liner for a small open boat in the freezing dark seemed absurd. Some lingered near the rail, chatting or smoking, expecting to be called back inside once the situation was sorted. On the port side, Second Officer Lightoller's strict interpretation of women and children first created long pauses in loading. Boats sat ready with empty seats while Lightoller scanned for eligible passengers, turning men away even when space was available. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch was more flexible, filling empty places with men if no women or children were nearby. Language barriers added to the confusion. Many third-class passengers, especially immigrants, were slow to reach the boat deck. Some were delayed by locked gates meant to control access between classes, gates that crew members had to unlock or break open. Others simply could not believe the ship was in real danger and hesitated to leave their cabins. As crew members tried to herd passengers toward the davits, the chill intensified. Breath hung in the air. Somewhere forward, the list of the deck became more noticeable, a subtle tilt that made some turn their heads toward the dark sea. Occasional flashes from distress rockets lit the night sky, casting brief, ghostly shadows over the deck. Their brilliance should have signaled urgency, but to many on board they seemed merely part of an unusual nighttime spectacle. The disconnect between reality and perception was dangerous. Below, Titanic was filling with thousands of tons of water. Above, her passengers still moved. With the unhurried grace of an evening promenade, this fragile illusion would not last. Soon the gap between the officer's urgency and the passenger's disbelief would begin to close, and the pace of events would quicken. The order was centuries old, born of maritime tradition and a sense of chivalry. Women and children first. On Titanic's decks that night, it became both a moral code and a logistical challenge, shaped by each officer's judgment and the chaos of the moment. On the port side, Second Officer Charles Lightoller enforced the rule with absolute strictness. He allowed no men into the boats unless there were no women or children in sight, even if seats remained empty. This interpretation meant that some lifeboats left with far fewer than their capacity. In one case, Boat 6 was lowered carrying just 28 people, though it could hold 65. On the starboard side, First Officer William Murdoch took a more pragmatic approach. He gave priority to women and children, but filled remaining spaces with men, passengers and crew alike. As a result, boats on his side tended to launch more fully loaded, though still far from their limits in the early stages. For women, the choice to board was not always easy. Many resisted leaving husbands, fathers, or brothers behind. Some needed persuasion or even physical assistance to step into the lifeboat swinging out over the black water. In several cases, couples tried to stay together until the last moment. A few men were waved into boats at the insistence of their wives. Among the children, fear was often sharper. The sight of the narrow wooden craft suspended high above the sea was intimidating, and the freezing night air made little faces pale. Mothers clutched them tightly, steeling themselves for the descent. Crewmen tried to lighten the mood with calm voices, reassuring smiles, and firm guiding hands. As the process continued, the differences between the two sides of the ship became more pronounced. Lightoller's boats went down half full in the early going, while Murdoch's filled more quickly. The imbalance would later fuel debate over whether discipline or flexibility saved more lives. For now, the lifeboats that did launch drifted slowly into the dark, their occupants watching Titanic's towering profile recede. A glowing giant still afloat, still magnificent, yet already surrendering to the cold sea. The band had begun to play on the boat deck, their music drifting into the night, a strange counterpoint to the urgency at the davits. As the lifeboat swung out and the night air thickened with tension, a small group of men took up their instruments on the boat deck. Led by Wallace Hartley, Titanic's 8-piece band began to play. Not rousing marches, but gentle, familiar melodies meant to calm the nerves of those gathering near the rails. At first, the music blended easily into the scene, almost as if the evening's entertainment had simply shifted outdoors. Passengers in heavy coats paused to listen, some smiling faintly, others tilting their heads in recognition of a favourite tune. The strains of waltzes and light opera floated over the deck, mingling with the calls of officers and the faint creak of davits lowering boats. The band's purpose was unspoken but clear. Music softened the edges of fear, gave the night a strange elegance, and helped maintain an illusion of control. Even as the ship's bow dipped lower, the rhythms of Alexander's ragtime band, or song d'automne, provided a sense of normalcy that steadied both passengers and crew. Hartley and his musicians played without pause, moving from light-hearted pieces to hymns and popular ballads. They stood in the cold without coats, instruments trembling slightly in their hands, but their focus never wavered. More than one passenger later remarked that the band seemed unconcerned by the danger, though in truth they must have understood the gravity of the moment. As the night wore on, the music shifted in tone. Some survivors recalled the hymn, "Nearer, My God, to Thee," as one of the final pieces. Others insisted it was a waltz. The exact tune may never be known, but the image of the band playing while the ship was dying would become one of the disaster's most enduring legends. For those in the lifeboats, the sound carried eerily over the still water. Long after the ship's shape began to darken against the horizon, faint notes could still be heard, a reminder of the courage and dignity of men who chose to serve others until the end. And all the while, distress rockets bloomed white above the masts, their light briefly illuminating the musicians, the crowd, and the ship's great funnels against the star-strewn sky. At regular intervals, a sharp whoosh split the night as another distress rocket soared skyward from Titanic's deck. Each one climbed high into the blackness before bursting into a brilliant white bloom, hanging for a moment against the stars before fading into the dark. The flashes lit the faces of those on deck, pale, intent, and upturned, as if all eyes were waiting for an answer from the horizon. The rockets were the most visible plea for help, their bright signal meant to be recognized by any ship within sight. From Titanic's bridge, the crew knew the Californian was somewhere nearby. They had seen her lights earlier in the night. Surely, they thought, the rockets would be unmistakable. Out on the open sea, however, meaning was not always clear. On the Californian, officers saw the distant bursts, but debated their intent. White rockets could signal distress, or they could be a celebration, a ship honouring a passenger or marking a holiday. Captain Stanley Lord, resting in his cabin, was told of the sightings but gave no order to wake the wireless operator or approach. The Californian remained still, locked in by ice. On Titanic, the rockets did their work in silence. Each launch drew a momentary hush from the crowd, followed by the return of the same urgent activity. Loading lifeboats, calling for women and children, adjusting ropes and falls. The flashes also carried to the lifeboats already in the water, where survivors glanced upward and wondered if rescue might be only minutes away. Yet the rockets brought no reply. No answering flare from the dark horizon. No ship steaming toward them. The night stayed vast and empty, the sea's surface unbroken, except for the scattered boats drifting further from the liner's towering side. As the last rockets flared and fell, their light seemed to underline a grim truth. Help was not coming in time, and still the band played, and still the officers called for more passengers to the boats as Titanic inched lower into the black Atlantic. The hour was drawing late, and the ship's end was no longer a distant possibility. It was approaching fast. By the time the last distress rockets had burned out, Titanic's bow was deeply submerged, the forward well deck awash in black, icy water. The ship's great stern lifted gradually into the air, exposing more of her propellers with each passing minute. Passengers still clinging to the tilting decks could feel the change. The incline grew steeper, the footing more treacherous. Inside, glassware slid from shelves, furniture scraped across floors, and loose luggage tumbled down passageways. The once proud grand staircase was now a steep slope, its ornate balustrade gleaming under the fading electric lights. The generators deep in the belly of the ship strained to keep the current flowing, but seawater was already flooding the dynamo rooms. Then, around 2:18 a.m., with a sharp crack and a deep groan of twisting metal, Titanic's spine gave way. Witnesses described the sound as a thunderclap beneath the sea, followed by a roar as the ship's structure tore apart between the third and fourth funnels. The bow, heavy with water, broke free and plunged into the depths, dragging a maelstrom of bubbles, debris, and human figures with it. The stern, momentarily relieved of its forward weight, settled briefly before rising sharply into the air. For a few moments it stood nearly vertical, silhouetted against the starlit sky, an image that would etch itself into the minds of survivors. Those still aboard clung to railings or slid toward the now submerged section, many swept into the freezing sea. Without the support of the bow, the stern's structure could not withstand the forces acting upon it. The hull plates buckled, decks split, and the final section of the ship began its own descent. In less than 3 minutes, the last visible part of Titanic slipped beneath the surface, leaving only a scattering of debris and the fading echoes of the disaster. For those in the lifeboats, the It was both awe-inspiring and horrific. The largest ship in the world vanishing into a silent ocean, her lights gone, her music stilled. In the darkness that followed, the cries of hundreds filled the air, a sound survivors would never forget. When Titanic's stern disappeared beneath the surface, hundreds of passengers and crew were thrown or forced into the open Atlantic. The water was a lethal 28 degrees, just below freezing, cold enough to sap strength in seconds and bring unconsciousness within minutes. The shock of entry stole the breath from even the strongest swimmers. Many instinctively thrashed, desperate to keep their heads above the black water. For those wearing life jackets, the cork-filled vests kept them afloat but offered no protection from the cold. The frigid water bit into flesh like knives. Breath came in shallow gasps, hands and legs quickly turned numb. Muscles refused to respond, and the simple act of keeping one's head above water became an exhausting battle. The scene was chaos. Men, women, and children cried out for help, their voices carrying over the still sea. Some called for loved ones who were already gone. Others shouted for lifeboats to return. Pieces of wreckage bobbed among the swimmers. Planks, deck chairs, overturned collapsible boats. A few clung to these in the hope they could stay out of the water even partially for just a little longer. The sound of hundreds struggling together was overwhelming. The splashes of arms and legs, the ragged gasps for air, the cries of "Help!" and "Mother!" and "For God's sake!" Above it all, the night remained cruelly beautiful, the stars cold and bright overhead. From the lifeboats, survivors watched in stunned silence. The officers feared that rowing back into the mass of people would swamp their craft. A few pleaded with the boat crews to return, but most stayed where they were, unwilling to risk the fragile safety they had. In the water, time lost meaning. The cold crept inward, dulling pain, slowing thought, and finally bringing a strange calm. One by one, the voices began to fade. For those who lived to tell it, the memory of that moment, the sea filled with human cries, then the eerie silence that followed, would haunt them more than any other part of the night. Amid the freezing blackness, survival often came down to what could be grasped in those desperate first moments after hitting the water. All around, the surface of the Atlantic was littered with debris torn from Titanic's decks, broken planks, barrels, hatch covers, and dozens of wooden deck chairs. These floating scraps became lifelines for the handful of people strong enough, or lucky enough, to reach them. Some managed to haul themselves partially onto wreckage, keeping most of their bodies out of the icy water. Even a few inches of elevation could mean precious extra minutes before hypothermia took hold. Others clung with both arms, their bodies still submerged but buoyed just enough to keep breathing. One group found a large piece of paneling, its varnished surface slick with seawater. They crowded together on top, balancing carefully as small waves lapped over the edges. Another cluster of men and women clung to an overturned, collapsible boat, its canvas roof sagging into the sea. With no way to right it, they spread themselves across the hull like seals, lying flat to keep from sliding off. Among the most famous survivors was Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who found himself in the water after Titanic's final plunge, pushed against the capsized coal. Absible by the rush of men and debris, he climbed aboard with dozens of others. Throughout the night they took turns shifting their weight to keep the makeshift raft from sinking under them. Others were not so fortunate. Many who reached wreckage lacked the strength to hold on. Numb fingers slipped away, bodies drifting silently into the dark. Those who remained clung tighter, muscles locked in a final act of will. The sea around them was quiet now, save for the occasional groan of wood or the splash of a body moving closer to a piece of flotsam. The stillness was deceptive. Death was all around, working silently in the cold. For those balancing on their fragile islands, the hours ahead would be long. The wreckage could delay the inevitable, but it could not promise rescue. In the distance, the faint shape of lifeboats floated on the horizon, and the hope of being pulled aboard was the only warmth they had left. For a time after Titanic vanished, the night was filled with the cries of hundreds fighting to stay alive. The sound was unlike anything survivors could describe, a vast human chorus of desperation layered with pleas, shouts, and moans that carried across the still Atlantic. From the lifeboats, the voices seemed to come from all directions at once. Some called names again and again, searching for loved ones in the dark. Others shouted, "Help!" in ragged gasps until their strength failed. The cries rose and fell like waves, surging in moments of collective panic, then thinning to isolated voices. In the freezing water, those cries came from people in every condition, some clinging to wreckage, others treading water, still others floating motionless, their voices already weak. The cold stripped away strength with cruel efficiency. Fingers went numb, arms lost power, and lungs burned with the effort of breathing. Survivors in the lifeboats later spoke of the unbearable torment of listening. Many rowed in silence, their faces set, trying not to meet each other's eyes. Some pleaded with the officers to turn back, but fear of being swamped by desperate swimmers kept most boats at a distance. Only a few lifeboats would eventually return, and by then the sea would be mostly silent. Gradually, the chorus faded. One by one, voices fell away. A sudden cut-off, a fading whisper, or a final cry swallowed by the dark. The stillness that followed was not relief, but something far worse. Survivors later described it as an awful, eerie silence, broken only by the creak of oars and the occasional splash of water against the boats. That silence marked the moment when hope for most of those in the water was gone. Those who still clung to life did so quietly now, their strength conserved for the faint chance of rescue. For the rest of the night, the memory of those dying calls would hang over the survivors like a shadow. Years later, many would confess that it was not the sight of Titanic's sinking that haunted them most. It was the sound of human voices filling the night, then vanishing forever. The lifeboats, adrift in the icy darkness, were far from places of safety in spirit. Each was its own small world, carrying its own mix of fear, conflict, and desperate decisions. Some boats had been launched half empty, their crews now regretting the wasted space. Others were dangerously overcrowded, so low in the water that a slight shift in weight could send icy waves lapping over the sides. Oars creaked and splashed as men tried to row away from the sinking ship, but the night was so still that every movement felt amplified, the silence heavy between strokes. In several boats, debates flared. Passengers argued over whether to return to the cries in the darkness. Some pleaded to go back, insisting they could save more people. Others, often led by crewmen, warned that desperate swimmers could capsize the fragile craft, dooming those already aboard. In many cases, the fear won. One of the most notable exchanges came in Lifeboat 6, commanded by Quartermaster Robert Hitchens. When passenger Margaret Molly Brown urged they return, Hitchens resisted, insisting they would be swamped. Words grew heated, with Brown rallying others to take up the oars. While the boat did not go back immediately, Brown's determination kept them rowing toward the faint promise of rescue. Some boats were without proper crew, leaving passengers, many who had never handled an oar, to take turns rowing under the stars. In others, men tried to shield shivering women and children from the cold with coats, scarves, or their own bodies. Ice formed on hair and clothing, the bitter air cutting through even the thickest garments. On the overturned collapsible B, survivors balanced on the hull, water washing over their legs. Any sudden movement threatened to throw them into the sea. Charles Lightoller, the senior surviving officer, took charge, keeping order and shifting weight to keep the boat afloat until morning. Each lifeboat carried its own quiet drama, shaped by the choices and silences of the night. Some boats rowed aimlessly, some huddled together in near darkness, and some argued under their breath. All shared the same question: would anyone reach them before the cold, the sea, or despair claimed them? For the survivors adrift in Titanic's lifeboats, time seemed to dissolve into the cold and the dark. With the ship gone, there was no point of reference, only the endless expanse of black water beneath them and the pitiless canopy of stars above. The horizon was a thin, indistinct line, and the night stretched on without mercy. The cold was the most immediate enemy. Even those wrapped in furs or heavy coats felt it seep steadily inward, numbing fingers and toes, then stiffening limbs. Breath came in clouds of white, and frost formed on hair, lashes, and collars. Children whimpered softly, huddled in the laps of mothers who tried to shield them from the wind. Men shifted position to keep blood flowing, stamping their feet against the boards of the boat. Conversation was sparse. Most sat in silence, listening to the creak of the boat and the distant slap of oars from other craft. Occasionally someone would glance toward the dark where Titanic had been, as if half expecting her lights to reappear. Others avoided looking back altogether, staring instead into the cold, black emptiness ahead. The hours crawled. Some boats tried to row toward a faint light in the distance, the Californian, though they did not know it. But the effort seemed to make little progress. Others simply floated, unwilling to exhaust themselves before help arrived. Every so often, a boat's passengers thought they heard a distant sound, a shout, a splash, a faint echo of music. But each time the noise faded into the stillness, and they were left with only the groan of wood and the lapping of water. It seemed impossible that the night could last so long. The eastern sky remained stubbornly dark, and with each passing minute the cold claimed a little more of their strength. When at last a faint grey began to spread along the horizon, it felt unreal, as if dawn were only a mirage. Yet it was real, and with it came the first signs that their ordeal might soon end. Somewhere beyond that growing light, a ship was racing toward them. In the early hours of April 15th, as the first pale light of dawn crept over the Atlantic, the dark silhouette of a ship began to form on the horizon. For the exhausted survivors huddled in the lifeboats, it was a sight almost too good to believe. Word spread quickly from boat to boat. A ship is coming. It was the RMS Carpathia, a Cunard liner bound from New York to Fiume. Her captain, Arthur Rostron had been asleep when Titanic's distress call came through just after midnight. Without hesitation, he ordered his ship turned toward the given coordinates, pushing her engines to full speed, a dangerous 17 knots through waters he knew were scattered with ice. Rostron's preparations during the 4-hour dash were meticulous. Crewmen rigged cargo nets, lowered gangway doors close to the waterline, and readied ropes and Jacob's ladders for pulling survivors aboard. Blankets, hot drinks, and medical teams stood waiting. Lifeboats from Carpathia were swung out, ready to launch if they had to pick people directly from the sea. By 4 a.m., Carpathia reached the edge of the ice field. Towering bergs floated in the morning gloom, forcing Rostron to weave his ship carefully among them. Then, as the sun began to rise, they spotted the first Titanic lifeboat, a small shape rocking gently in the swell. Cheers and sobs broke out in the boat as Carpathia drew alongside. Ropes and nets were lowered and survivors were hauled up, many too numb to climb unaided. Some collapsed on deck, overcome with relief. Others clung to the hands pulling them up, unable to speak through chattering teeth. Over the next 4 hours, Carpathia worked methodically, collecting each boat in turn. Crew and passengers alike lined the rails, offering blankets, tea, and whatever comfort they could give. In the lifeboats, faces were drawn and pale, eyes red from cold and grief. As the last boat was brought alongside, the scale of the disaster began to emerge. Hundreds were saved, but hundreds more were gone. In the vast expanse of morning-lit sea, there was no trace of Titanic herself, only drifting ice and scattered debris. The rescue itself was as harrowing as the night that preceded it. As Carpathia drew alongside the first lifeboat, her crew and passengers leaned over the rails, calling encouragement to the haggard figures below. The seas were calm, but the boats pitched slightly in the swell, making the climb to safety a careful, exhausting effort. Jacob's ladders and rope nets hung down the liner's side, swaying gently. Some survivors, still able to move, gripped the cold ropes and climbed hand over hand, their stiff limbs protesting each pull. Others had to be hauled bodily upward, lifted in canvas slings by teams of sailors. Mothers passed their children up first, trusting strangers with the most precious thing they had left. Blankets and hot drinks awaited on deck. Crew members wrapped shivering passengers in wool and guided them to makeshift shelters in the lounges and dining saloons, now transformed into infirmaries and rest areas. Stewards carried the weakest below, their feet never touching the deck. Among the first aboard were women and children, their faces pale from hours in the lifeboats. Many were too numb to speak. Some clutched small bundles, handbags, coats or keepsakes, the only possessions salvaged from the disaster. A few carried pets, half hidden under blankets, their presence a fragile link to a world that no longer existed. With each new boat, the enormity of the tragedy became clearer. Some lifeboats arrived half empty, the survivors inside casting haunted glances at the vacant seats where friends or family might have been. Others were overcrowded, their passengers cramped and stiff, helping one another up the nets with what little strength remained. The Carpathia's passengers, woken in the night to aid in the rescue, moved quietly among the newcomers, offering coffee, biscuits, and gentle words. The air was filled with the low murmur of voices, the clink of cups, and the occasional muffled sob. As more boats came in, Captain Rostron kept the Carpathia steady among the drifting ice. All around, icebergs loomed in the morning light, silent witnesses to the night's horror. By the time the final boat was brought alongside, it was clear. They had saved as many as they could. By mid-morning on April 15th, all known survivors from Titanic's lifeboats were aboard the Carpathia. Only then could the grim accounting begin. Officers moved quietly through the lounges, dining saloons, and cabins where survivors were resting, taking down names and, where possible, cabin numbers. The process was slow. Many were in shock, some barely able to speak, others reluctant to face the truth. As the lists took shape, the scale of the loss became undeniable. Out of more than 200 passengers and crew who had set sail from Southampton, only about 705 were now aboard Carpathia. That meant more than 1,500 souls, men, women, and children from every deck, had been lost to the Atlantic during the long night. The figures were staggering not only in total but in their uneven distribution. First-class passengers had survived in greater numbers, partly due to their proximity to the boat deck and the priority given to women and children. In third class, where many had been delayed or confused during the evacuation, the toll was far higher. Among the crew, losses were devastating, especially among the engineering staff who had remained below to keep Titanic's power running until the end. Word of the death toll spread through the Carpathia in hushed conversations. Some survivors clung to the hope that other ships might yet arrive with more rescued. But by late morning, it was clear no other vessels would be bringing additional passengers. The sea around them was empty, save for drifting ice and wreckage. Captain Rostron compiled the final list of the saved to transmit by wireless, knowing the world was already waiting for news. Each name sent would bring relief to some family, while the absence of others would confirm the worst for countless more. The mood aboard was a mix of relief and deep mourning. Survivors who had lost loved ones sat in stunned silence, staring out at the grey Atlantic. Others wept openly, comforted by strangers. Few spoke above a whisper, as if loud voices might shatter the fragile calm. By the time the Carpathia turned south toward New York, the numbers were fixed in the minds of all aboard. Hundreds saved, but far more gone. A loss too great to ever be forgotten. As Carpathia steamed away from the ice field, the ship seemed wrapped in an invisible shroud. The survivors, now safe from the sea, were not yet free from the grip of the disaster. Shock clung to them like the damp chill in their clothes. In the saloons and lounges, women sat wrapped in blankets, staring into cups of untouched tea. Some clutched a child or a salvaged handbag as if afraid that letting go would mean losing everything left to them. Others sat alone, lips moving silently, replaying in their minds the last moments they had seen loved ones alive. The Carpathia's passengers, now turned caregivers, moved quietly through the rooms. They offered warm drinks, spare clothing, and gentle words. In one corner, a steward read aloud from a newspaper to an elderly woman who had lost her glasses. In another, a young mother tried to hush her baby, her voice trembling with exhaustion. Conversations, when they came, were halting. Survivors recounted how they had reached the boats, how they had seen the ship's stern lift high before vanishing, how the cries in the water had faded to nothing. Some spoke in detail, almost compulsively, as if by describing the events they could make sense of them. Others could say nothing at all. On deck, men gazed out over the sea, seeing in every berg a phantom of the one that had struck Titanic. The weather was clear, the ocean deceptively calm, the same calm that had hidden the iceberg the night before. Below decks, the wireless room tapped steadily as names and brief messages of survival were sent to shore. But for each message sent, there were countless others that could not be written, their recipients left only with silence. Captain Rostron kept Carpathia's course steady toward New York. The journey would take 3 more days, 3 days in which those aboard would live between two worlds, the horror they had escaped and the uncertain reception awaiting them on land. No one aboard could yet grasp the full weight of what had happened. They were safe, but they were also shipwrecked, the last to have seen the Titanic alive and the first to carry her story back to the world. The 3 days that followed were unlike any voyage the Carpathia had ever made. She moved steadily toward New York, her decks crowded with a mix of her original passengers and the 705 survivors from Titanic, all bound together by an unspoken grief. Captain Rostron ordered that Titanic's survivors be given priority in accommodations, meals, and medical attention. First-class passengers from Carpathia surrendered their cabins so that women and children could rest in privacy. Public rooms became makeshift dormitories lined with cots and blankets. The ship's dining saloon served meal after meal, though many survivors could barely eat, their stomachs clenched by cold and shock. The wireless room became the ship's beating heart. Operators Jack Bride of Titanic, injured but still able to work, joined Carpathia's crew to send out the official passenger list and brief messages. Families on both sides of the Atlantic waited anxiously for each update, scanning newspapers and gathering at shipping offices. Every confirmed survivor's name brought relief to some, and silence for others. Weather during the passage remained calm, but the atmosphere aboard was heavy. Survivors often clustered together, finding comfort in the company of those who had shared the same boats. They traded fragments of the night's events, sometimes correcting each other's memories, sometimes falling into long silences. One lifeboat group reunited on deck and spent hours staring eastward toward the place where Titanic had gone down. Another group, mostly young emigrants, gathered in the evenings to sing softly in their own languages, a fragile act of hope in the wake of loss. As the Carpathia approached New York Harbor on the evening of April 18th, fog and rain closed in. On the docks, thousands had gathered despite the weather. Reporters, photographers, family members, and the merely curious. Police lines strained to hold back the crowd. In the harbour, tugs and small boats waited to escort the liner to her berth. For the survivors leaning over the rails, the sight of the city was bittersweet. They had reached their destination alive, but without the ship, the voyage, or the companions they had expected. The skyline of New York rose through the mist like a promise kept, and a reminder of everything the sea had taken. When Carpathia docked in New York, the shock of the Titanic disaster rippled instantly through government halls. In Washington, Senator William Alden Smith, already aware of the confusion and rumors surrounding the sinking, moved quickly. Within hours of the survivors' arrival, the United States Senate announced it would hold a formal inquiry into the disaster. Smith's urgency was partly practical. The majority of Titanic's senior surviving officers and crew were British citizens, and there was a real chance they might return home before giving testimony. The Senate's swift action ensured they could be questioned while events were still fresh in their minds. Subpoenas were issued immediately, and hearings began just 2 days after the disaster on April 19, 1912. The Senate hearings convened at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York before later moving to Washington. Survivors, from first-class passengers to firemen from the engine room, were called to recount their experiences. Captain Arthur Rostron of Carpathia testified about the rescue, describing in detail the ice field, the condition of the survivors, and the absence of any other ships in sight when he arrived. From Titanic's crew, harrowing accounts emerged. Second Officer Charles Lightoller described the evacuation procedures, the strict enforcement of women and children first on the port side, and the gradual realization that there were nowhere near enough lifeboats. Wireless operator Harold Bride testified about the relentless sending of CQD and SOS messages, the ships that answered, and the silence from those that did not. The hearings also sought to uncover the decisions made before the collision. Why was Titanic steaming at near full speed in known ice conditions? Why were so many ice warnings not acted upon? And why were lifeboats launched half empty in the early stages of evacuation? Public interest was intense. Newspapers printed long excerpts from the testimony, feeding both outrage and fascination. The hearings painted a picture not of a single catastrophic mistake, but of a chain of errors, oversights, and misplaced confidence. a system that had failed as completely as the ship herself. Senator Smith would ultimately issue a detailed report, but even in these early days, one truth was clear. Titanic's sinking was more than a maritime tragedy. It was a human and institutional failure on an unprecedented scale. While the US Senate investigation unfolded across the Atlantic, the British government prepared its own official inquiry. The Board of Trade, responsible for maritime regulation in the United Kingdom, convened proceedings under the direction of Lord Mersey, a respected judge and experienced investigator. The British inquiry began on May 2, 1912, at the Scottish Drill Hall in London, before moving to Caxton Hall for later sessions. Its scope was broad: to determine the causes of the disaster, evaluate the conduct of Titanic's officers and crew, and assess whether current safety regulations had failed. Lord Mersey presided over a panel that included experienced mariners, engineers, and nautical experts. They heard testimony from 97 witnesses over 36 days, ranging from surviving officers to shipbuilders from Harland Wolff, and even lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. Fleet's account of spotting the iceberg and the absence of binoculars in the crow's nest drew particular public attention. The inquiry examined technical details of Titanic's design, including the watertight compartments, lifeboat arrangements, and the ship's stability. Harland Wolff's chief designer, Edward Wilding, provided calculations showing that flooding 6 compartments, as had occurred, made sinking inevitable. Like the US hearings, the British inquiry probed the decision to maintain near full speed despite repeated ice warnings. Captain Edward Smith's long career and reputation for caution were weighed against testimony that steaming fast through ice was common practice among large liners at the time. The nearby Californian was also scrutinized. Testimony from her officers and crew conflicted over whether distress rockets were seen and understood, and why no rescue attempt was made. The inquiry would later criticize the Californian's inaction as a missed opportunity to save lives. The final report, issued in July 1912, concluded that the loss of life was due to an insufficient number of lifeboats, the ship's speed in dangerous waters, and inadequate emergency procedures. However, it stopped short of condemning White Star. Line executives, or Harland Wolff, framing the disaster as the result of established maritime practices rather than criminal negligence. For many, this conclusion felt unsatisfactory, yet the inquiry's recommendations, including stricter lifeboat requirements, continuous wireless watch, and changes to iceberg monitoring, would reshape maritime law for generations. The news of Titanic's sinking spread rapidly in the days after the disaster, and by the time Carpathia docked in New York, the world was already gripped by shock. Newspapers devoted entire front pages to the tragedy, printing survivor lists alongside haunting headlines. Titanic sinks, over 1,500 dead. Photographs of the great liner, her passengers and her crew appeared beside grim artists' renderings of her final plunge. For families awaiting word, the publication of the names confirmed long hours of anxious hope, or delivered the final blow of certainty. Outside White Star Line offices in New York, London, and Southampton, crowds gathered day and night to read the latest bulletins. In Southampton, home to many of Titanic's crew, the disaster was deeply personal. Nearly every street lost someone. Flags flew at half-mast, shops closed, and church bells tolled in somber tribute. Public outrage grew as details emerged. The shortage of lifeboats, the half-empty boats launched early, the ignored ice warnings. Editorials demanded answers, condemning what many saw as reckless confidence and corporate negligence. In America, Senator William Alden Smith was praised for moving swiftly to hold hearings. In Britain, the Board of Trade faced harsh criticism for outdated safety regulations. At the same time, acts of heroism were celebrated. Stories of Captain Smith remaining on the bridge, of bandleader Wallace Hartley and his musicians playing to the end, and of individuals who gave up their lifeboat seats for others were retold in newspapers and memorial services alike. These narratives offered some comfort, framing the disaster not only as a story of loss, but also of courage. Churches across both sides of the Atlantic held memorial services, some attended by thousands. In New York, a service at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine drew mourners from every social class, while in London, King George V and Queen Mary led the nation in observing a day of mourning. The sinking had crossed all boundaries, rich and poor, famous and unknown, and the grief was collective. Yet beneath the mourning lay a sharper feeling. This had not been an unavoidable act of nature. The Titanic disaster was human-made, and the public wanted to know why. The pressure on governments and shipping lines to act would soon lead to changes that transformed maritime safety forever. The loss of Titanic was more than a tragedy. It was a wake-up call for the maritime world. In the months following the disaster, both the US Senate and the British inquiry issued strong recommendations that would lead to sweeping reforms in shipping regulations. Foremost among these was the lifeboat requirement. Before Titanic, regulations in both Britain and the United States were based on a ship's tonnage, not her passenger capacity. This meant that even the largest liners were only obliged to carry boats for a fraction of those aboard. Titanic, with space for over 2,200 passengers and crew, carried just 20 boats, enough for about 1,178 people. After the inquiries, the law was changed to require lifeboat capacity for every soul on board, regardless of ship size. Wireless communications also came under scrutiny. Titanic's distress calls were not heard by all nearby ships because many operators simply turned off their sets at night. New rules mandated 24-hour radio watches, along with reserve power sources to keep equipment running in emergencies. Ships were also required to keep a continuous log of all messages sent and received. Perhaps the most significant international reform came with the establishment of the International Ice Patrol in 1914. Operated by the US Coast Guard, the patrol's mission was, and remains, to monitor iceberg movements in the North Atlantic and warn ships of hazards along major shipping lanes. Aircraft, later satellites, would join the effort to ensure that no ship could claim ignorance of dangerous ice. Navigation practices were tightened as well. Captains were now expected to reduce speed or alter course when ice was reported nearby, a shift from the earlier culture of maintaining speed unless visibility was poor. Lifeboat drills for passengers became mandatory, as did crew training in evacuation procedures. These changes did not erase the loss of Titanic, but they ensured that her fate would not be repeated under the same circumstances. As one British parliamentarian put it during the debates, "We owe to those lost souls the resolve that their deaths shall not have been in vain." The disaster had rewritten the rules of the sea, and in doing so, it had changed the very definition of maritime safety. In the final analysis, both the US Senate and British inquiry agreed on one uncomfortable truth. The Titanic disaster had been as much a product of human complacency as of ice and steel. The ship had been designed, operated, and sailed in an era when faith in technology often outran caution. The belief in her practically unsinkable design was not simply a boast. It had influenced nearly every decision made before and during the voyage. Lifeboats were seen more as a courtesy than a necessity. They were intended to ferry passengers to rescue ships, not to serve as the only hope of survival. Crew and passengers alike assumed the ship could withstand any reasonable accident and that any delay or inconvenience would soon be remedied. This confidence extended to Nav. Navigation practices. Maintaining near top speed in known iceberg waters was not unique to Titanic. It was common among transatlantic liners racing to meet schedules and uphold reputations. Slowing down for ice was viewed as an unnecessary concession to caution, a mindset that the disaster would shatter. The inquiries also underscored how small oversights can have enormous consequences. Ice warnings not passed to the bridge, binoculars locked away in a forgotten cabinet, lifeboats lowered half empty. None of these errors alone doomed the ship, but together they formed a chain of failure. Each link was shaped by the assumption that nothing truly serious could happen. Perhaps the starkest lesson came from the Californians' inaction. The sight of distress rockets on the horizon, debated but not acted upon, revealed how even the clearest signals could be ignored when urgency is not felt. It was a reminder that preparedness is not only about equipment and rules, but about the mindset of those who hold lives in their hands. In the years after the disaster, these lessons were written into law and drilled into maritime culture. But the deeper warning, that overconfidence can blind even the most skilled and experienced, remains timeless. Titanic's sinking was more than the end of a ship. It was the end of an age of unshakable faith in progress without limits. The iceberg had not just torn through steel, it had cut into the very idea that human achievement was invincible. From the moment the news reached the world, Titanic's story began to take on a life far beyond the disaster itself. Newspapers and magazines seized on the drama. The wealthy and powerful lost alongside the humble emigrant, the band playing as the ship sank, the gallantry and sacrifice told in survivors' accounts. Within weeks, the tragedy had entered the realm of legend. Early 20th century audiences were captivated by the stark contrasts, the opulence of the unsinkable liner against the frozen emptiness of the North Atlantic, the speed and confidence of modern progress undone in a single night. Poets and playwrights penned elegies. Artists painted dramatic scenes of the final plunge. In London, New York, and Paris, theatre productions reenacted the disaster while it was still fresh in memory, often with survivors in the audience. The story reached into every corner of popular culture. Postcards, commemorative plates, and even sheet music memorialized the ship. Ballads like "The Wreck of the Titanic" were sung in music halls and around family pianos. For many, these cultural retellings became their primary image of the disaster, shaping public memory as much as, or more than, the official reports. As decades passed, Titanic's image shifted but never faded. She became a symbol of human hubris, of nature's power over even the grandest achievements. In wartime propaganda, she was invoked as a warning against overconfidence. In peacetime, as a romantic tragedy that blended heroism with loss. The discovery of the wreck in 1985 gave the story fresh power. Photographs and video of Titanic's bow, still majestic in the gloom 2.5 miles down, reignited public fascination. Museums, documentaries, and exhibitions brought the artifacts of the ship and her passengers back into the light, making the disaster tangible to new generations. No other maritime tragedy has so thoroughly embedded itself in the world's imagination. Part history, part cautionary tale, part myth, Titanic endures not only because of the scale of the loss, but because her story resonates with themes as old as human ambition, and as modern as the next great technological gamble. The ship may lie silent on the ocean floor, but in the minds of millions she still sails, forever bound for that cold April night. For more than 7 decades, Titanic lay hidden in the darkness of the North Atlantic, her exact resting place unknown. Countless theories circulated about her final position, and several expeditions tried and failed to locate the wreck. The depth, nearly 2.5 miles down, made the search a monumental challenge, especially in an era before modern deep-sea technology. It was not until September 1st, 1985, that a joint American-French team led by Dr. Robert Ballard and Jean-Louis Michel finally found her. Using the US Navy research vessel Nor and a deep-sea submersible towed camera system called Argo, they scanned the ocean floor in a slow, methodical grid pattern. One early morning, the camera revealed a massive boiler lying alone on the seabed. Minutes later, the haunting image of Titanic's bow emerged from the darkness. The discovery stunned the world. Contrary to some earlier depictions, Titanic had not sunk in one piece. The wreck was split in two, the bow section largely intact and the stern twisted and collapsed from the breakup. Debris stretched across the ocean floor for thousands of feet. China plates, shoes, bottles, and other artifacts frozen in time. The images of the wreck brought a mix of awe and sorrow. The graceful curve of the bow, still recognizable after 73 years, was coated in rust-colored formations nicknamed rusticles. The name Titanic could still be read on the hull. For many, these sites transformed the disaster from a distant legend into something tangible and immediate. Ballard and his team made the decision not to remove artifacts during the initial expedition, believing the wreck should be treated as a gravesite. In the years that followed, other missions would recover thousands of items, sparking ongoing debate about the ethics of disturbing the site. The wreck's discovery also reignited Titanic fever worldwide. Documentaries, books, and exhibitions brought her story to new generations, now paired with real images of the ship's remains. The cold reality of the seabed, silent, immense, and untouched except by time, became the final chapter in the ship's journey. The Titanic had been found, but the questions, fascination, and emotions she inspired were as alive as ever. In the decades after Titanic's sinking, the disaster became surrounded by a cloud of myths, some born from misunderstanding, others from the human need to create meaning in tragedy. Separating fact from fiction has been one of the lasting challenges for historians. One of the most enduring myths is that Titanic was universally believed to be unsinkable. In truth, the phrase came from promotional materials and a few early press articles. Shipbuilders and crew knew that no vessel was truly indestructible, yet the idea was repeated so often after the disaster that it became shorthand for the arrogance of the age. Another misconception is that the ship was racing to break a transatlantic speed record. While Titanic was making good time, she was not competing for the blue riband. Captain Smith was maintaining a schedule. Though it is true that he, like many captains of the era, did not slow down despite ice warnings. Popular retellings have also exaggerated the class barriers during evacuation. While third-class passengers did face delays, partly from physical distance to the boat deck and partly from language and layout confusion, there was no deliberate locking of gates to keep them trapped. Investigations found that many barriers were left open, but the lack of clear guidance and time still proved fatal for many steerage passengers. Even the image of the band playing Nearer My God to Thee as the ship went down has variations. Some survivors swore they heard it, others recalled different tunes. What is beyond doubt is that bandleader Wallace Hartley and his musicians played until the end, offering a measure of calm amid the chaos. Finally, the role of the Californian remains debated. While her failure to respond to distress rockets is widely criticized, conflicting testimonies about distances, visibility, and the interpretation of signals leave parts of the story in shadow. Dispelling myths does not diminish Titanic's power. In many ways, it strengthens it. The truth reveals a tragedy not of one villain or one fatal flaw, but of many small decisions, each shaped by the culture, technology, and confidence of its time. It was precisely this chain of ordinary choices, rather than a single extraordinary error, that led to one of history's most extraordinary disasters. Behind every statistic from the Titanic disaster lies a human life, a story cut short, a family left incomplete. The numbers are stark: more than 1,500 dead, just over 700 saved. But within those figures are individuals whose absence would ripple through generations. Entire families were lost together, their names recorded only on memorial lists. In some cases, the sole survivor was a single child or a parent who would return home to an empty house. Southampton, the home port for most of Titanic's crew, became a city in mourning. Streets were dotted with black draped windows, and in some neighborhoods, nearly every household had suffered a loss. Among the dead were celebrated figures: millionaire John Jacob Astor IV, industrialist Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, who famously refused a lifeboat seat so his wife Ida could remain by his side. But the majority were anonymous in life: emigrants seeking new beginnings, sailors earning a living, servants and labourers whose names never made headlines. The toll was not only in lives lost, but in the grief carried by those who survived. Some passengers endured survivors' guilt for the rest of their days, haunted by the memory of others left in the water. Crew members who escaped in lifeboats faced whispered accusations, regardless of the circumstances. For many, the trauma of that night lingered in dreams, in sudden silences, and in an unwillingness to speak of the event. Even material losses had lasting impact. For immigrant families, all possessions were often carried aboard. When the ship went down, entire livelihoods were erased. In wealthier circles, fortunes were altered by the death of heirs and business partners. Charities on both sides of the Atlantic raised funds for widows and children left without support. Titanic's sinking also claimed an emotional toll on the public imagination. It became a shared tragedy across continents, not only because of the scale of the disaster, but because it seemed to reach into every stratum of society. In Titanic's lifeboats, wealth and poverty sat side by side, equally dependent on the mercy of the sea. The human cost of that April night cannot be measured only in numbers. It lives on in the stories told, the letters preserved, and the silence that falls when a name from the passenger list is read aloud. More than a century after her sinking, Titanic's name still carries a weight that few other shipwrecks can match. Her story has been told and retold in books, films, songs, and museum exhibits, each generation finding in it something that speaks to its own fears and hopes. Part of her enduring legacy lies in the tangible changes she inspired. Maritime law was transformed. Lifeboat capacity now matched every soul aboard. Wireless rooms stayed manned around the clock, and the International Ice Patrol kept watch over the North Atlantic. Every modern passenger ship, with its lifeboat drills and safety briefings, carries a trace of Titanic's lessons. Yet her impact reaches beyond regulation. Titanic became a cultural touchstone, a symbol of the fragility of human ambition. She was born in an age that believed technology could master nature, and her loss became the era's humbling moment, proof that no engineering triumph was beyond the reach of disaster. For many, her story remains personal. Families of victims and survivors have passed down photographs, letters, and oral histories. Annual memorials in cities from Belfast to Halifax to New York keep the memory alive. The wreck itself, discovered in 1985, serves as both a time capsule and a grave, its bow still pointing toward the depths where she came to rest. Titanic's legend has also proven elastic. In some tellings, she is a romantic tragedy, a stage for gallantry and sacrifice. In others, she is a cautionary tale of corporate greed and human overconfidence. Both views coexist, adding layers to her mythology and ensuring that her name is never reduced to a single meaning. What remains constant is the fascination. The more is learned about her through expeditions, research, and personal testimonies, the more compelling the story becomes. The Titanic disaster endures not because it was unique in loss of life, but because it was uniquely poised between the old world and the modern, a place where Victorian faith in progress met the stark realities of the 20th century. Her voyage lasted only 4 days, but her story has sailed through more than 100 years, touching millions who never saw her decks. And as long as the sea itself inspires awe and respect, the name Titanic will be spoken, as warning, as memory, and as legend. The story of Titanic begins with dreams. The dream of a ship so grand it could carry the hopes of thousands. The dream of engineering mastery that could tame the Atlantic. For 4 days, those dreams seemed real, her decks alive with music, conversation, and the promise of safe arrival. Then came the night of April 14th, 1912, and the world learned how fragile such dreams could be. In just over 2.5 hours, the largest ship afloat became a broken shadow beneath the waves. More than 1,500 lives were lost, not through a single moment of chaos, but through a chain of decisions, assumptions, and silences. For the survivors, the journey did not end in the lifeboats. They carried the weight of that night for the rest of their lives. In the memories of faces vanishing into the dark, in the sounds of voices fading over the water, in the knowledge that fate had spared them when it had spared so few. The disaster changed more than laws. It reshaped the way the world thought about safety, responsibility, and the balance between progress and humility. Titanic's sinking became a warning etched into maritime history, that no vessel, no matter how advanced, is immune to the forces of nature and the limits of human foresight. And yet, her story is not only about loss, it is about courage in the face of the inevitable. The musicians who played to calm fear, the engineers who kept the lights burning, the men and women who gave up their seats so that others might live. It is about the bonds that form in moments of crisis, and the truth that humanity's greatest measure is often revealed in its darkest hours. Over a century later, Titanic still lies in the cold silence of the North Atlantic, but she sails on in memory, not just as steel and rivets, but as a living reminder of all that was gained and lost on that April night. Somewhere beneath 2.5 miles of water she rests, her bow still facing the direction she never reached. Above her the ocean swells and the stars turn as they did on the night she fell. And in the minds of all who know her story, the Titanic is still moving forward, forever bound for a dawn that never came.